Let me first thank God for this humbling experience to be with the members of his human family, and to my good friend and my leader and mentor, Representative Larry Hall, to my North Carolina Equality family, Chairman Wood, Executive Director Campbell. Tonight I want to accept this humbling award on behalf of the cause of justice and all of those who believe in fundamental human rights and human dignity for everybody. In this, what I think has been deemed the keynote address, I want to tell you a story. Every time I go to jail, I pray. And when I pray, I ask God, what would you have me to do? Twice I went to jail with Reverend Nancy Petty, whom I believe is an angel in disguise as a Baptist preacher. 2.5 years ago, I was getting ready for bed about 11:30 p.m. and was quite despondent because we could not seem to get people, some clergy, to rally support of children in Wake County. I picked up the paper late that night before going to bed, and I read a beautiful letter to the editor of the Raleigh News and Observer, and it was signed simply Nancy Petty. She wrote that she was the mother of 2 kids in Wake County schools and that she agreed completely with something that I had said one of our mass meetings protesting the far right's efforts to resegregate Wake's nationally acclaimed diverse school assignment policies. I don't know what led me to read her letter, to pick that paper up at 11:30 that night, but I can remember clearly that it revived my spirit, made my heart overflow, and I had the crazy idea in the middle of the night that I would call Miss Petty and tell her how much her letter meant to me. And so that night I called Nancy, and we had a wonderful talk, and we set up a meeting to talk some more. This story, you need to hear it in order to understand the Amendment 1 fight and the fights beyond. Well, it turned out that Miss Petty had left out of her letter 2 other important facts about herself. Besides her being a mother, she was Reverend Nancy Petty, and that night we did not talk sexuality. We talked about children and what mattered for all children. Only later actually, when someone was criticizing us standing together and trying to be ugly, did I learn that she was the first openly gay minister at the historic Pullen Baptist Church that had been a great advocate in civil rights down through the years. Nancy, we became close friends in jail and jailbirds together. Twice, not based on politics, but based on the soul and the kind of camaraderie that forms when you fight for justice together. Twice we went to jail together. Her directness, her honesty, her steadfast support of the anti-racism, anti-poverty movement we call Historic Thousands on Jones Street that we had been building for 6 years has been a great source of strength to me and our movement. I invited her to speak to Historic Thousands on Jones Street. She asked me to come and preach at Pullen, and then I invited her to preach at Greenleaf. When the national and local far-right millionaires came up with their scheme of buying 4 Wake County School Board seats in 2009 and promote Ron Margiotti to be its chair in November 2009, the NAACP asked him several times to meet. Mr. Margiotti did not answer our request. Finally, Reverend Petty, Dr. Tim Tyson, who's here tonight, the famed gospel singer Mary Williams, and I decided that if Margiotti would not meet with us, we would go meet with him at a public hearing to petition him and his right-wing ideologues for redress of our grievances. We looked into his eyes. He had that look of fear, that look of hatred towards diversity. He spun his chair around, and rather than listen or look at us, he stood up and walked out of the room, and when he had returned, he said, "Arrest them." When we got out of jail, all of us were told we could not go on school grounds until our trial. Nancy Petty and Mary Williams both had kids in Wake schools, and they wanted to ask that Margiotti's order be amended to allow them to take their kids to school and meet with their kids' teachers. We drove to the edge of the board's big building to hand a written request to an officer to deliver to Margiotti. Mr. Margiotti had told his police, arrest Reverend Petty, myself. But also there that day was Reverend Greg Moss, the leader of about 500,000 black Baptists in North Carolina at the time. And while we were standing on the sidewalk, when people inside heard we had been arrested, about 20 young people and their elders, intergenerational, different races, different creeds, different sexualities, sang freedom songs, prayed, held hands, and sure enough, they were arrested too and joined us in jail. Nancy Petty and I went through these epiphanies together. While we were building the movement, the revived Jesse Helms machine in North Carolina tapped the national right-wing forces for millions of dollars to pay for openly racist and homophobic television and mailer ads to attack centrist Democrats for being Obama supporters or even NAACP allies. North Carolina businessman Art Pope, with money and organizational support from the Koch brothers, paid for the ads in targeted House and Senate districts that showed me, NAACP President Ben Jealous, and a black man in a prison jumpsuit sneaking around a white suburban neighborhood with the message that we wanted to let convicted killers and rapists off death row to threaten housewives. When we went to the Republican headquarters to request the GOP denounce the ads, the chair ducked into the back room, refused to meet with us. They continued the vicious, bigoted, and untruthful ads and managed to win majorities in the House and Senate. When they took office in January 2011, they made their agenda clear. Use wedge issues, abortion and gay rights to divide and distract us, and hope that while we were chasing those rabbits, they would sneak through their reverse Robin Hood budget after midnight. Until the extremists took over in the General Assembly, the NAACP was always welcome to meet with the leaders of both parties. But like Margiotti, Speaker Tom Tillis, had 3 times ignored and played games with our traditional request for meeting at the start of the session. He refused to sit down with our historic Thousands on Jones Street coalition. So we reserved a large room at the legislature and put together an afternoon public education about critical issues the great majority of North Carolinians were facing. We invited all legislators to our educational session, a few steps from the House chambers. And then a group of us, black and white ministers, some with the Council of Church, some with the AME Zion Church, some with the Baptist Church, entered the balcony of the People's House to invite the legislators to attend the large assembly next door to the House chamber. I stood up in those chambers and asked a simple question while they were passing a budget that would devastate educational funding and safety nets for the poor. It was not a rhetorical question. It was a question I thought they were familiar with, since all of them put their hands on the Bible and swear themselves into office. The question was simply, what doth the Lord require? And the other ministers required to do justice and to love mercy. Before I could invite him, Speaker Tillis shouted, "Arrest him, arrest him." And when a member of the media asked the speaker that afternoon why he had ordered our arrest, he said, because we disrupted his house. Now, I give you this background, this story, to say that the struggle we're in is a long one. It demands grace. It demands courage. It will have ebbs and flow. We didn't come together, as some have wrongly said in the media, when the Amendment 1 fight began. We were already together. That's the point. Last summer before last, we learned the Tea Party Republicans had decided to put a bill up to vote that had been drafted by some national Republican advisors to make same-sex marriage unconstitutional in North Carolina. Because we were already together, we were able to stand. I counseled and prayed with my sister Nancy, who is also a member of the NAACP, and so should you be. I wrote and published an open letter on the Tillis Amendment. Tillis allowed 1 hour for debate. They quick voted to put the Amendment 1 on the May 8th, 2012 primary ballot. As Equality North Carolina and its many friends geared up for what they believed was going to be a unilateral fight, you invited me as the NAACP president to preach the ideas in this open letter to this annual convention last year. I shall never forget the electricity that shot through the crowd as I spoke. I shall never forget the young man that came and cried on my shoulder and just thanked me that a minister would even see him as a fellow human being, which I thought was so problematic and such a bad character for those who claim to walk around with in the cloth, that they would cause a young person that kind of hurt. And yet, I saw the waves of hope and love and relief and laughter and joy as we realized there was new hope in the room, swept over all of us, black and white, gay and straight, young people, to a new movement, a movement of young folk, a movement of old warriors. All of us we knew. I think last year we might lose the battle, but we'd already won the war. What seemed like a complicated knot that had tied up the progressive movement in California and other places came apart easily just by pulling the right strings of justice, love, and humility. And so, as this story continued, the national far right sent in their paid organizers to North Carolina to stir up votes in favor of Amendment 1. They were sent to both black and white churches where their Tea Party cadre had been working using the time-tested tactic of fear-mongering. They paid a few black ministers, some of them friends and colleagues of mine, to make radio and TV ads and to preach on the sins of homosexuality. But the NAACP stuck to our argument that matters of conscience and private morality were matters for the church and religious framework, that America made a firm separation between matters of conscience and matters of civil society, and that no member of any minority can afford to permit a majority to vote to be taken to allow the government to decide our fundamental human rights. And the story continued. We had faith, since we had seen it happen many times in our struggle, that if we worked hard, stuck to our strong moral constitution and scientific positions, we could reach the minds and the hearts of thousands of voters with our radio announcements, our newspapers ads, and the thousands of voter mailings. I know many of us were devastated the night of May 8th. I know that young people particularly who have been fed the illusion that North Carolina is reasonable, indeed a progressive state, were disillusioned with the buckets of ice-cold waters of fear and hate and hypocrisy. However, African Americans and our Latino brothers and sisters have always known that even in North Carolina, where at times we have progressed, the Tar Heel soil is fertile ground for hate and fear. And we've always known and can never be deluded that the fight will be long and that there are no shortcuts. We must reduce fear through public education, through the streets and in the courts and in electoral campaigns. We must dare to struggle and dare to win. And from my religious tradition, I view defeat as merely a prelude to a season of hope. Our opponent's campaign was built on hypocrisy and cynicism. Ours was built on truth and hope. The day before the May vote, 7 of us who dared to ask the House Speaker what the Lord required stood trial in Raleigh. And while awaiting for the judge to decide what sentence would be, praying in that courtroom, I thought about the fact that in less than 2 weeks, the National NAACP Board would meet in Florida. While in that courtroom, I thought, wouldn't it be something If we could come up with a resolution to pass at that meeting that would give hope to people and untie another knot in the people's movement. The judge interrupted my thoughts, finding my friend and brother Reverend Curtis Gatewood and me guilty of disorderly conduct, which I wear as a proud badge of service to justice. I'm sure that in that courtroom, the same angels who brought me the paper that night to read Nancy Petty's letter led me to think about taking North Carolina's position to the national level. I was firmly convinced it was the right thing, and after talking to scores of disappointed, disillusioned, fearful people, the next night after the votes were counted, I could feel their isolation, their fear. I talked it over with our national board member, Carolyn Q. Coleman. And on May 19, 2012, Chairman Brock asked me as president of the North Carolina NAACP and chair of the National Political Action Committee to present in closed session to the NAACP board the lessons learned in our recent struggle in North Carolina. With my sister, Nancy, in mind, and all of you in mind, I said the following to the board. The question regarding the equality of rights for the LGBT community and our citizens and same-sex couples is not a question for Black America. It is a question for America itself. When we say we the people, when we say equal protection under the law for all people, does that mean only those who we agree with personally and religiously? Do we mean some people and not others? And if this is the case, we then render the noble sentiments of our democracy and the lofty language of inclusion to be painfully hypocritical. I went on and said to the board, theologically and from a biblically based, Bible-centric perspective of the Judeo-Christian faith, the issues that should dominate the public square ought to pertain to how we treat the poor, the sick, and children, and women, and those on the margins, and those unaccepted. I said to them, the reality is when you examine the voting records and public policy positions carefully, the same forces fighting us on voting rights and educational equality and economic justice and addressing racial disparities in the criminal justice system are the same ones behind the attacks on the LGBT community. I asked the board to consider with me that the forces advocating to hurt the LGBT community also advocating to reduce taxing to the wealthy and increase the burdens on the poor. They advocate strengthening criminal justice laws while ignoring racial disparities in the criminal justice system. They support policies rooted in a philosophy of Jim Crow and James Crow Esquire through photo ID and race-based redistricting. I told them that in our recent fight down here in North Carolina against the Discriminatory Amendment 1, we learned that once the NAACP and our allies properly framed and contextualized the issue, the people quickly grasped how the treatment of LGBT citizens is an issue of civil rights and human rights. I said to them that in each of North Carolina's 5 largest cities, voters in majority Black precincts, regardless of what the media reported, the facts say they rejected the measure. Charlotte, 52%. Raleigh, 51%. Greensboro, 54%. Winston-Salem, 55%. Durham, 65%. Somebody ought to tell the truth. Not one single majority Black precinct supported the amendment. Several crushed it by margins of 3-1 and even 4-1. And yes, even in rural North Carolina, where we have seen islands of resistance, the amendment failed 2-1 on the African American side of Scotland Neck. If we frame the issue right, I told the board, I noted to the board that within our democracy, because of the First Amendment, we have a right to disagree or agree on issues of personal and religious morality. However, because of the 14th Amendment, we do not have the license to enact laws that because of our religious or private conviction force a particular lifestyle or remove equal protection of the law from any citizen. I reminded them that this was not a new position for us. The NAACP has always opposed any custom, tradition, practice, or law or constitutional amendment that denies any right to any person. I asked them to stop for a minute and remember the history of amending the U.S. Constitution. Our nation had to fight a long and bloody civil war in order to amend the Constitution, on paper at least, and to begin to expand the protections to all persons. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection. The 15th Amendment provided voting rights. The 19th Amendment guaranteed voting rights for white women. The 23rd Amendment provided voting rights in presidential elections. The 24th Amendment eliminated discriminatory poll tax in federal elections. And the 26th Amendment provided voting rights for younger persons 18 to 21. No other amendment had ever restricted the rights of any person except the two established and then repealed. And when we look at the history of the U.S., there has never been an amendment to narrow protection, but only ones to expand their protection to all persons and to remedy past injustice. And then I said to the board, those who think the sons and daughters of the civil rights movement can't see through their Trojan horse trick when they try to use wedge issues to seduce us into being a part of their scheme to deny LGBT citizens fundamental rights must be crazy. And we cannot do it on our watch. And finally, in that closed session, I said, from a moral perspective, my reading of the Bible says that Jesus commanded us to love one another, no exceptions. He made this clear by setting an example of going out of his way to show love for people who had been excluded and marginalized. And after 30 minutes in closed session, late afternoon, May 19th, the 64-member board of the National NAACP debated and passed a strong resolution supporting equal rights for gay marriages. I wrote it, so I know what's in it. And not only did I write it, I had the privilege of conferring with Julian Bond, and then I had the privilege of making the motion that the NAACP Constitution affirmatively states our objective to ensure political, education, social, and economic equality of all people. Therefore, the NAACP has opposed and will continue to oppose any national, state, local policy or legislative initiative that seeks to codify discrimination or hatred into the law, or to remove the constitutional rights of LGBT citizens. We support marriage equality consistent with equal protection under the law provided under the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Further, we strongly affirm the religious freedom of all people as protected by the First Amendment. And when the vote was taken, and when it was passed, I felt a great joy. I knew it was a historical moment for America. I knew we had done the right thing. I flew home to Goldsboro and unwound at my Greenleaf Christian Church, preaching the next morning, and finally home with my family. And that afternoon, after months of travel and preaching and teaching and writing and texting and email and responding to the challenge that the Lord sends to all of us daily, I recall the wonderful events of the past few years ever since I got that letter from Nancy Petty one late night. Now, there are some lessons, as I conclude, that we must learn. One of them is we cannot buy into the regressive right, ultra-right strategy to build a wedge between the African-American community and the LGBT community. And we have to be careful of our own description of the politics. I had to challenge some of my friends, my white friends, my liberal friends, during the marriage amendment fight, who would say that whether the amendment passed or failed, it was on the backs of black people. Don't ever repeat that, because black folk have had enough put on their backs without this one being added to. First of all, it's not empirically true. According to the voting statistics, as the disappointing votes were counted last May, two figures leaped out. Over half the black voters who voted against the amendment had changed their position once we came in coalition and dealt with it as a civil rights issue. And those who voted against the amendment was larger than the percentage of whites. To blame any one community is a waste of time, and it creates unnecessary divisions. Instead, what we should do is spend our energy seeking to organize and find allies in every community. Another lesson we must learn is, particularly progressive and liberals, is not to throw away the high moral grounds and walk away from religious discourse. We cannot assume that the majority of people who confess faith do so along the same criteria of the ultra-conservative so-called religious right evangelicals. The truth is, and some of you might be shocked when I say it tonight, I'm a Christian evangelical conservative. You can't buy their rhetoric and accept it willy-nilly. You have to unpack it. You've got to exegete it. I'm a Christian evangelical conservative because I believe that many of those who claim to be conservative are actually quite liberal. Because while they talk religion, they liberally leave out any mention of the centerpieces and the heart of faith. I want to conserve what's at the heart of faith. And at the heart of faith is love. At the heart of faith is justice. At the heart of faith is fairness for all people. So you go tell. You go tell Franklin Graham and all those other cohorts of those who call themselves conservative that you met a real conservative and one who knows Jesus, and we got a question. Why do they say so much about what God says so little and so little about what God says so much? Furthermore, if we are to broaden and deepen the electorate, particularly on this issue, we must recognize that there are friends and allies of the LGBT community who may not endorse a particular lifestyle. Listen to me now, religiously or culturally, but their non-endorsement is not rooted in the meanness and hatred of the ultra-conservative. It has another theological base. It has another exegetical perspective. But what you must understand, when we face when the issue is framed along the lines and requirements of loving all humanity and seeing all people as brothers and sisters, when the issue is framed as a fundamentally a constitutional right guaranteed every person regardless of their race, creed, class, gender, or sexuality, equal protection under the law, these persons who may not necessarily agree with a particular lifestyle will stand beside and defend the LGBT community every day and every time. And we got to work there too. Thirdly, we must also have a deep commitment to building and strengthening what I call 21st century fusion politics. As my sister Nancy and I showed, we can't just wait until my issue is being attacked and then want to rally the people. She was with the NAACP on educational equality long before the marriage amendment fight began. And we must have a 21st century form of fusion politics where we stay together not sometimes, but all the time. And that agenda must be broad. The NAACP and North Carolina Equality, we need to stay together on economic sustainability and addressing systematic poverty and the lack of jobs, and ensuring the wealthy pay their fair share, and providing living wages and labor rights, and guaranteeing every child a high-quality education, and ensuring health care, and protecting Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security, and addressing the disparities in our criminal justice system, and enforcing equal protection under the law, regardless of race and creed and class and gender and sexual orientation, and securing equal rights and full citizenship for our Latino and other immigrant brothers and sisters, and protecting and expanding voting rights. If our agenda is big enough, we can stay together. And if we stay together long enough and strong enough, then we will win. If I was at my church, I'd say, touch your neighbor and tell them, we need more than sporadic unity. Remember, y'all, it was fusion politics in 1868, right after the Civil War. Blacks and whites fused together, created a new political electorate in the South, rewrote the state constitution. Together, they guaranteed voting rights and equal protection under the law, and expanded labor rights, and pushed progressive tax reform to address the economic injustices created by slavery. And again, in the 1960s, this city is a part of it. There was fusion politics throughout the South that took on Jim Crow and segregation. Blacks and whites and Jews and Protestants and Catholics and students and labor unions created a new kind of politics with a deep moral commitment to nonviolence and anti-racism and anti-poverty. They had hope and faith and possibility of reconstructing the nation toward what she had promised on paper, to build a more perfect union, to establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for the common defense, to promote the general welfare. The energy and the ethic of that movement, that fusion, not only tore down Jim Crow in the face of viciousness that some thought couldn't be overcome, that same energy brought us Brown versus Board of Education, expanded the promises of the Social Security to those who had been left out in 1935, created a political atmosphere for the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that made it illegal not only to discriminate against African Americans, but women and the handicapped and the disabled. This energy and the ethics of this fusion movement created the political space for the war on poverty and the establishment of Medicaid and Medicare and the passage of the Voting Rights of 1965 that not only protected the rights of African Americans, but allowed white women and women to sit on juries by expanding representation from the House of Congress to the State House to the courthouse. This power of fusion politics produced the 1968 voting fair housing law that finally helped us give 18 to 21-year-olds the right to vote. Now, each of these movements face backlashes, and vicious, mean backlashes. But my point is, every time this fusion happens in America, it becomes a little more beautiful and helps her mend the flaws of injustice and inequality. And so, in 2006, we embarked upon a journey to build a 21st century fusion led by the NAACP called HK-on-J People's Assembly Coalition. My friend Al McShirley came up with the name. Many of us have walked together. We came together around a 14-point agenda, including in 2006, the goal of fighting all forms of discrimination. Five years before the Amendment 1 fight, we said it was time, Representative Hall, to inject a new politics in the veins of North Carolina's public square. 60 organizations then, 140 now, and we've seen the fruit of this fusion. Winning same-day registration, early voting in North Carolina is some of the fruit of that fusion. Being able to stand up against voter ID and give a Southern white female governor the backbone to do what no other Southern governor did, to veto voter ID. That's a part of the fruit of this fusion. Taking on the General Assembly last year when the regressives passed a budget that unconstitutionally, in just one line item, hurt 64,000 poor children who were eligible for a program. And winning that fight in the court is a fruit of that fusion. The NAACP, Democracy North Carolina, the League of Women Voters, and the A. Philip Randolph Institute taking on the race-based redistricting plan passed by the General Assembly that we're going to win, because if we don't, it could set back political representation for 20 years. But our coming together is the fruit of fusion. The Truth and Hope Poverty Tour, seeking to demand that we address the fact that in North Carolina there are 1.6 million poor people, 600,000 children, 751,000 living in deep poverty. Putting a face on poverty, telling the truth about poverty is fruit of this fusion. Being able to mount a campaign in North Carolina against Amendment 1, and though we lost, being able to change the dialogue in the nation, move the NAACP national, and inspire coalition work in Maryland, and seeing Maryland become a state that chose to vote the way it did. That's fruit that comes from the fusion. Last year, Stuart, when you and I were together, more than 15,000 people gathered in front of the General Assembly, the most diverse coalition of its type ever seen in the South in recent years. Over 140 organizations, black, white, labor, gay, straight, all holding hands together. This is the fruit of fusion. And that's why there's been so much money in North Carolina to go back. That's why it's been so much energy to divide us. Because a tree is known by the fruit it bears. And the fruit of this fusion, the forces of regression can see it. And now they're betting that we're going to become despondent because of the way the elections turned out here in North Carolina. But I would dare challenge you in this room tonight that this is no time to be despondent in North Carolina or in America. There's too much evidence that things are changing. We've seen President Obama win by the most diverse electorate in the history of this country. His election means the Supreme Court will not be getting any more ultra-conservative judges anytime soon. His election has got the radical right so confused, they don't know who to blame. One of the security guards in the bathroom asked me, would I contribute to the RCB fund? I said, what's that? He said, that's the Republican Crybaby Fund. They bet, listen, that race would trump reason. And inflammatory rhetoric in the tradition of Barry Goldwater would cause America not to be rational in their consideration. But it did not work. The Tea Party found out that when their tea is diluted by truth, it loses its taste and cannot satisfy most America's appetite for doing what's right. His election proves that black people and Latino people are not fooled by wedge issues like gay marriage and will not follow the paid false prophets of the far right. His election proves that the civil rights know a Trojan horse when we see one. And even this year in North Carolina, though he lost by under 100,000 votes, the right knows something is afoot because the margin is so much less than what they're used to in a presidential election in North Carolina. We must look deeper and not become despondent. More than 1 million African Americans and Latinos early voted. African Americans made up more than 23% of the electorate this year. Latinos made up 4%. Just think about that for a minute. 23 plus 4 is 27. That means you only need 24 more percent to get to 51, and 51 is a majority of 100%. So if we work together, stay in coalition together, don't become despondent, build this fusion movement, progressive white, labor, Latino, LGBT, and African American, we can come together, make up the other 24%. And that changes our politics forever. So my friends, this is no time to be despondent and wring our hands. It's a time to keep building, a time to keep strengthening and building the tides that bind us. They pushed back, we must push forward. We must believe that in the work of justice, defeats are only temporary. right never ultimately loses. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy always comes in the morning. The truth of the matter is, I come from a faith tradition that believes that life can be resurrected out of death, and pain can produce power and deeper camaraderie. Mountains of despair can be molded into stones of hope, and that life, the truth is, truth outweighs lies, and love is still more powerful than hate. So this is no time to be despondent. It's a time to believe a little deeper. It's time to dig the foundation of our coalitions a little deeper. It's time to love one another a little deeper. It's time to become more than political allies, but brothers and sisters. If 15,000 of us stood together last year at HK in front of the legislature, we need 30,000 this year. 30,000. Now we must lobby like never before, fight in the courts like never before. I have an idea, and I've been sharing it around the country. I need some of you all to help me share it with those in money. They spent $50 million in Wisconsin and lost a recall. I have an idea. Why don't they give us 10% of that $50 million? Give us $5 million. Let us hire 4 organizers per electoral votes for the next 4 years in North Carolina. That's 60 organizers. And let's turn them loose in the African-American community, in the Latino community, in the white community, in the LGBT community, in the labor community, and in the faith community. And let's see, if we had 4 years of continuous organizing, can't we reshape politics in North Carolina? Can't we break open the solid South? Can't we turn this nation around? And so, as my grandmother said, it's time to dig a little deeper down in your soul. It's time to steady your spine and declare I ain't gonna let nobody turn us around. I often think about the challenge when I was born, August 30th, 1963, 2 days after the March on Washington. And if Bayard Rustin, who was openly gay, could organize the March on Washington over against the president not wanting them to march, over against vicious racists not wanting them to march, over against some in his own community not wanting to believe it could make a difference. But despite all the odds, they came together. Fusion politics took place and changed America. And echoing the words some of you heard that day, I still have a dream. I still believe they did it then, we can do it now. And so if I might preach just a little bit, one of my favorite passages of Scripture, is the Scripture that says the stone that the builder rejected has now become the chief cornerstone. In other words, God can use the rejected to produce revival. And I know in this room there are some who have known rejection. Rejection because of sexuality. Rejection because of who you love. Rejection because of how you were born. Rejection because somebody needed somebody to hate to try to feel good about themselves. There's folk in this room that have known rejection. Rejection because of income. Rejection because of faith. Rejection because of race. Rejection because of lack of faith. Rejection because somebody decided in their own ideology that they had a right, a false mandate to demean your humanity and my humanity given to us only by God. But I want you to know tonight that the stones that the builder rejected are now the cornerstones of this experiment called America. I want you to know tonight. That when the rejected get together, we can in fact redeem America from hate and discrimination. I want you to know tonight that when hands that once picked cotton join the hands of Latinos, join the hands of progressive whites, join their faith hands and join labor hands and join Asian hands and join Native American hands and join poor hands and join wealthy hands and join gay hands and join straight hands. When all those hands get together, when the rejected join hands, our togetherness becomes the instrument of redemption. And when we join hands, we can revive and make sure that the promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and equal protection under the law, and care for the common good will never be taken away or forfeited for anybody, anytime, anywhere. So together, the rejected coming together will revive a promise. This land is your land. This land is my land. Together, we will ensure and make sure that hope, not hate, has the last word in the State House, in the White House, and even at the ballot box. Together, we will ensure that all God's children are respected and treated with dignity. Together, the rejected will redeem the heart of America, and we will make sure that this nation lives out its promise. One nation under God, indivisible, 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 with liberty and justice for all.